Hey everyone! This is a quick reminder to subscribe and hit that like button. It lets me know that you are enjoying my content. Also, feel free to drop your suggestions for future stories in the comments below. Thank you for listening, and let's dive right in. When I first got the call about the rooftop garden job, I didn't think much of it. Temporary work until they found someone permanent. Easy enough. I'd always liked working with plants, and after months of job hunting, it felt like the garden had come at just the right time. I should have known better. Miss Hawthorne met me at the entrance that morning. She stood beside the glass door that led to the rooftop, hands clasped neatly in front of her. Her dark blazer and pencil skirt made her look more like a museum curator than a garden manager. She barely glanced at me before unlocking the door. "Follow the rules, and the garden will treat you well," she said without preamble. Her voice was low, calm, like she'd given this warning 100 times before. Ignore them, and it won't forgive. I shifted my backpack on my shoulder, unsure how to respond. "I don't think I'll have any trouble." Her eyes snapped to mine, sharp and unblinking. "Good." She pushed the door open. The air changed the moment I stepped onto the rooftop, warmer, thicker, like stepping into a greenhouse on a humid day. Sunlight poured over stone pathways that wove between flower beds, potted shrubs, and climbing vines draping over wrought iron arches. The faint hum of bees drifted from somewhere nearby. Beyond the garden's edge, glass and steel towers stretched across the city skyline, but up here, they felt like a world away. I followed Miss Hawthorne along the main path, my shoes clicking softly against the stone. The flowers seemed to shift slightly as we passed, their stems tilting ever so subtly toward us. I told myself it was the breeze, though I didn't feel any wind against my skin. We stopped near a small maintenance shed, tucked beside a vine-covered wall. Inside, neatly folded clothes rested atop a wooden bench, a set of dark green coveralls with my name stitched above the pocket. A canvas tool belt hung beside them, its pouches filled with pruning shears, gloves, and other equipment. On the shelf above, a weathered leather-bound notebook sat alone. Miss Hawthorne picked it up and offered it to me. The cover was soft with age, the corners worn. "Everything you need to know is in here," she said. I opened the notebook. The first few pages were handwritten in neat, careful script, the 7 rules of the rooftop garden. 1. The old lady in the corner. If you see the old lady sitting by the stone fountain, greet her politely. Never ignore her, and never sit beside her. 2. The garden's favorite flower. Always water the white lilies first. If they are not tended to before the others, the garden will reject your care. 3. The midnight rule. Never remain in the garden past midnight. If you hear leaves rustling when there's no wind, do not look back. Leave immediately. 4. The fountain's reflection. Avoid looking directly into the water of the stone fountain after sunset. If you see your reflection smile back, leave the garden for the night. 5. The art exhibits rule. If you pass the statue of the woman holding a rose, do not stop to admire it. Walk past without breaking stride. 6. The morning dew. If the morning dew is red, do not water the plants that day. Simply observe from a distance and wait until the dew returns to clear. 7. The garden's offering. Each week, leave a small offering beneath the oldest oak tree, fresh flowers, a silver coin, or a handwritten poem. Never forget this offering. I flipped to the last page. A single line was scrawled across the bottom in a different hand, darker and rougher. "These rules are not suggestions. The garden watches." A faint chill brushed the back of my neck. Miss Hawthorne stepped back from the doorway. "You'll be alone most of the time. The garden prefers it that way." She paused, eyes flicking past me to the flowers beyond. "Don't make it regret trusting you." And with that, she turned and left, heels clicking softly against the stone, until the sound faded into the distance. By late afternoon, I'd familiarized myself with the main sections of the garden. The flower beds arranged in winding patterns, the oak tree standing tall at the far end, its bark weathered and cracked. Several small coffee stands and art exhibits were scattered throughout, their colorful umbrellas casting pools of shade across stone tables. Despite the garden's beauty, a faint pressure lingered in the air, like being watched through a half-open door. I found the white lilies near the garden center, planted in a circular bed bordered by smooth gray stones. Their petals were stark against the deep green leaves, almost too perfect in their symmetry. Remembering the rules, I knelt and watered them first, careful not to let a single drop touch the other plants, until the lily's soil was damp and dark. The air felt slightly lighter as I stood, though the flowers around me still seemed to lean closer, as though listening. As the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the garden, I noticed her. The old lady sat beside the stone fountain near the southern archway. Her pale gray dress hung loose against her frame, and her silver hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders. Hands resting gently on her lap, she gazed into the fountain's water with eyes that seemed to see something far beyond its surface. I hesitated, heart quickening slightly as I recalled the first rule. Swallowing my nerves, I stepped forward and offered a polite nod. "Good evening." The old lady turned her head slightly. Her smile was faint but warm, and her gaze, though distant, held a depth that made my chest feel oddly heavy. "The garden remembers kindness," she said softly. Her voice seemed to linger in the air as I turned and made my way toward the exit, the path dipping briefly beneath an archway draped in ivy. I tried to shake the feeling of her gaze lingering on my back long after I was out of sight. By the time I reached the fountain near the entrance, the sun was dipping behind the distant skyline, painting the sky in muted orange and pale lavender. As I passed the fountain, I caught a flicker of movement in the water's reflection. I stopped. My reflection hovered just beneath the rippling surface, my face pale in the twilight, my eyes staring back. The rule echoed in my mind: avoid looking directly into the water of the stone fountain after sunset. I stepped back before I could see more and hurried toward the exit. The air beyond the garden felt thinner, easier to breathe as I locked the door behind me and descended the stairs. Still, even as I reached the street below, I couldn't shake the faint sense of invisible eyes watching from somewhere high above. The rooftop garden felt different the next morning, like it was waiting. I paused at the glass door before unlocking it, the cool metal key resting heavier in my hand than it should have. For a moment, the faint pressure of invisible eyes pressed against my back, as though something watched from beyond the garden's walls. I shook the thought away, took a breath, and stepped inside. The air wrapped around me instantly. Warm. Dense. The distant hum of bees and faint rustle of leaves carried no breeze. It wasn't unpleasant, but it always took a moment to adjust, like stepping into a place that belonged to someone else. I crossed the stone pathway toward the maintenance shed, the soles of my shoes clicking softly against the damp stone. The lilies were waiting. The white lilies stood in a neat circle near the center of the garden, their snow-white petals almost too vibrant against the dark soil. As I knelt beside them, their faint, sweet fragrance clung to the air, delicate but sharp enough to linger in my throat. Always water the white lilies first. I unscrewed the lid of my watering can, carefully soaking the soil around their roots until the earth darkened and glistened. A faint shiver seemed to pass through the nearby plants, as though the garden had exhaled in relief. As I stood, something shifted around me. The distant tulips seemed to stand taller. Roses, half closed in the morning sun, began to unfurl, their deep red petals catching the light. Even the ivy clinging to the stone archways seemed to drape more gracefully. The air warmed slightly, brushing my cheek like the heat from a nearby hand. I adjusted the tool belt on my hip and moved to the next flower bed. By midday, the garden buzzed with low murmurs of tourists drifting along the paths. Most passed with quiet admiration, snapping photos beside the stone fountain or sipping coffee beneath colorful umbrellas that cast shadows sharp as cut glass across the stone. Their laughter echoed between the ivy-covered walls, muffled but clear. I kept to my work, pruning the roses beneath a wrought iron arch where the vines coiled like fingers. As I clipped a stray thorn, a soft brush grazed my arm, the barest touch of petals against skin. I paused, glancing at the nearest rose. Its crimson petals swayed gently despite the still air, as though testing my presence. The warmth along my skin lingered as I stepped back. The first sign of trouble came with the sharp crack of a snapped stem. I looked up just in time to see a boy, no older than 7, dart past the nearest flower bed, a bright orange tulip clutched in his small hand. His mother called after him, her voice sharp with warning, but he ignored her, eyes wide with mischievous triumph. "Do not pick the flowers." The air shifted instantly. warmth vanished like a snuffed-out flame. A cold, hollow stillness settled over the garden, pressing against my chest. Somewhere nearby, a vine twitched, just a slight movement, but enough to catch my eye as it slid an inch across the stone. The boy's smile faltered. He dropped the tulip as though it had burned him and stumbled back, eyes wide with sudden fear. His mother reached him, gripping his arm as she glanced around with a nervous laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. I stepped forward, heart thudding. "It's all right," I said, my voice steady despite the tightness in my throat. "This part of the garden's off limits. Best stick to the paths, okay?" The boy nodded quickly, eyes flicking toward the vine that now lay still across the stone. His mother muttered an apology and hurried him down the walkway, their footsteps fading into the distance. The air warmed slightly, but the weight of invisible eyes lingered. I picked up the fallen tulip and set it gently beside the flower bed, resisting the urge to glance toward the shadows beneath the nearby coffee shop umbrellas. I worked through the afternoon, careful not to dwell too long in one place. The garden seemed to watch my every move, vines shifting slightly when I passed, flowers tilting toward my hands as though eager for attention. The air grew heavier as the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long and thin across the pathways. The last few tourists drifted toward the exit, their laughter fading as they passed beneath the ivy-covered arch. I paused near the center of the garden, wiping sweat from my brow as the faint hum of distant traffic reached my ears. The world outside felt impossibly far away from up here, like a half-forgotten memory just out of reach. As I turned toward the maintenance shed, my gaze caught on the statue of the woman holding a rose. She stood beside the eastern walkway, carved from pale stone that seemed to catch the last rays of sunlight. Her face was serene, her downcast eyes fixed on the rose cupped gently in her hands. I slowed without thinking. The rose looked different from before, its petals richer, more vibrant, as though freshly picked. A faint gleam of moisture clung to its edges, glistening like morning dew despite the dry air. Do not stop to admire it. Walk past without breaking stride. I tore my gaze away and quickened my pace, heart hammering against my ribs as though I'd woken from a half-forgotten dream. By the time I locked the maintenance shed, the sun had slipped below the horizon, painting the distant skyscrapers in muted gold and deep violet. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and made my way toward the exit, boots clicking softly against the stone as I passed beneath the ivy-covered arch. The air was still, warm with the faint scent of earth and flowers. Yet as I reached the glass door, a faint sound stirred the silence, soft and distant like the rustle of leaves against stone. I paused, hand on the door's cold metal frame. No breeze stirred the air. The vines clinging to the nearby wall were still, their leaves unmoving. The sound came again, closer this time. A faint shiver passed down my spine, tightening the muscles in my shoulders. Never remain in the garden past midnight. If you hear leaves rustling when there's no wind, do not look back. Leave immediately. I swallowed hard and stepped outside, locking the door behind me with a hand that wasn't quite steady. The cold air beyond the garden burned fresh against my skin as I descended the stairs, every step carrying me farther from the unseen gaze that lingered just beyond the walls. The faint rustle of leaves still echoed in my ears as I unlocked the garden gate the next morning. Sleep had been scarce, my mind replaying the sound of unseen footsteps behind me, too close and too deliberate to dismiss as a trick of the wind. I stepped inside, boots clicking softly against the stone path as the air settled around me, warm and heavy as ever. The hum of distant traffic faded, replaced by the faint buzz of insects hidden among the blooms. I took a step toward the white lilies and stopped. The grass beneath my feet glistened faintly with dew, but it wasn't clear and silver like before. A thin layer of crimson clung to the blades, darkening the soil where droplets had fallen. Even the petals of nearby flowers were speckled with red, as though the garden itself had bled overnight. If the morning dew is red, do not water the plants that day. Simply observe from a distance and wait until the dew returns to clear. The rule echoed in my mind as I clutched the watering can tighter against my side. I took a slow breath and backed away from the lilies, the faint pressure of unseen eyes trailing me as I moved along the path. By mid-morning, the first groups of tourists had begun to arrive. Their footsteps echoed softly against the stone, accompanied by the faint clink of coffee mugs and the low hum of conversation. Most wandered the paths with quiet admiration, snapping photos and pausing beside the fountain or beneath the ivy-draped archways. I worked near the roses, pruning stray branches and clearing fallen petals from the stone. The air was warm against my skin, but the faint scent of iron lingered beneath the usual fragrance of flowers and soil. I'd just finished trimming a low-hanging vine when the first shout broke the calm. "Hey, you're not supposed to be in there." I spun around just as a teenage boy darted across the grass near the white lilies, his friends trailing close behind. One of them, no older than 16, reached out and brushed the petals of a violet hydrangea, despite the small sign beside it. "Please do not touch the plants." "Hey," I called sharply, dropping my tools as I hurried toward them. "Stay on the path. This area's closed off." The air shifted. The warmth vanished in an instant, replaced by a hollow chill that seeped beneath my skin and into my bones. The laughter of the tourists faltered, their footsteps slowing as the air thickened with sudden tension. Then the vines moved. Thick green tendrils snaked across the stone walkways with a faint whisper of shifting leaves, curling over the edges of flower beds and sliding between cracks in the stone. Roots cracked through the earth, splitting the pathway beneath my feet as faint whispers echoed from the ivy-covered walls. Soft, urgent murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The boys scattered, their eyes wide with sudden fear as they stumbled back toward the main path. One of them tripped over a trailing vine, hitting the ground hard before scrambling to his feet. Come on, go!" The whispers rose in pitch as the air seemed to tighten around us, pressing against my chest with invisible weight. The tourists fled, their footsteps echoing against the stone as they vanished beneath the distant archway. I stood frozen, heart pounding as the vines twitched against the stone, inching back toward the flower beds with slow, deliberate movements. The whispers faded into silence. The air warmed slightly, though the chill beneath my skin lingered like a distant echo. I took a slow breath, pressing my hand against my chest to steady the rapid thrum of my heart before bending to retrieve my tools from where I dropped them near the roses. I spent the rest of the day tending the garden with more care than ever, trimming the ivy with deliberate gentleness, clearing fallen petals from the walkways, and wiping the dust from stone benches scattered beneath the shade of maple trees. Even as the air grew warmer, the faint pressure of unseen eyes never fully faded. By late afternoon, most of the tourists had gone, leaving the garden still and silent beneath the pale gold of the setting sun. I paused near the oak tree at the garden's edge, one hand brushing the worn leather pouch at my belt where the small silver coin rested beside my pruning shears. Each week, leave a small offering beneath the oldest oak tree, fresh flowers, a silver coin, or a handwritten poem. Never forget this offering. I shifted the tool belt higher on my hip and glanced toward the distant fountain. The air felt heavier than usual, but fatigue pressed against my shoulders as I made my way toward the exit. I never left the coin. That night, the dreams came, twisting vines sliding across cold stone, flowers blooming red with petals sharp as glass, shadows shifting behind ivy-covered walls, their whispers low and urgent against the hollow stillness of the air. Somewhere beyond the garden gates, faint footsteps echoed against stone, soft but deliberate, as though someone walked the garden paths beneath the midnight moon. I woke to the faint rustle of leaves against my bedroom window, the warmth of my blankets doing little to chase away the lingering chill beneath my skin. The white lilies had wilted. I knelt beside them the next morning, the copper watering can cool against my hand as I traced the edge of a petal between my fingers. The once vibrant blooms had begun to curl inward, their edges tinged faintly brown despite the warm sun overhead. Even the soil beneath them felt colder than usual, as though the earth itself had pulled back from their roots. I watered them carefully, soaking the soil until dark droplets clung to the smooth gray stones that bordered the flower bed. The air warmed slightly as I stood, but the distant hum of bees seemed fainter than before. I glanced toward the fountain near the southern archway, where the old lady sat with her hands resting lightly in her lap. Her pale gray dress seemed thinner beneath the early morning light, the fabric shifting faintly with the breeze that stirred the surface of the fountain's water. I hesitated, throat tightening as I approached. "Good morning," I said, forcing the words past the weight that clung to my chest. The old lady turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting mine with eyes that no longer held the warmth of days before. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her expression neither welcoming nor cruel, simply distant, as though she watched from a place I could never reach. Her gaze lingered a moment longer before she turned back to the water, without a word. I stepped back, the air heavier against my skin as I made my way toward the maintenance shed without looking back. The faint hum of tourists faded into the distance as I locked the garden gate that evening. The air had grown cooler with the setting sun, the distant glow of city lights reflecting faintly against the ivy-covered walls as I passed beneath the stone archway. I adjusted the strap of my backpack against my shoulder, boots clicking softly against the stone path as I passed the fountain near the entrance. The water shimmered beneath the fading light, rippling softly against the stone edge as I stepped past. And stopped. My reflection hovered just beneath the surface, pale against the dark water, my eyes hollow with fatigue, lips pressed into a thin line against the weight of invisible eyes that never seemed to blink. The air shifted. My reflection's head turned, slowly, unnaturally, until its gaze met mine directly. Its lips twisted into a wide grin that stretched too far, teeth pale against the dark water as its eyes seemed to deepen with impossible shadows. I stumbled back a step, heart hammering against my ribs as my pulse thundered in my ears. Avoid looking directly into the water of the stone fountain after sunset. If you see your reflection smile back, leave the garden for the night. I turned and fled, boots striking hard against the stone as the air seemed to press against my back with invisible weight. I didn't stop until I reached the glass door at the garden's edge, fumbling with the key before shoving it into the lock. The faint hum of distant whispers echoed from somewhere beyond the fountain, too soft to make out the words. I stepped outside without looking back, breath catching in my throat as the cold night air hit my skin like a shock of ice water. My hands trembled against the doorframe as I turned the key in the lock and backed away from the glass, heart still pounding against my ribs. The faint pressure of unseen eyes lingered long after I descended the stairs and vanished into the city streets below. I barely slept that night. The memory of my reflection's twisted grin clung to the edges of my thoughts, its hollow eyes waiting in every dark corner of my dreams. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the faint ripple of water and the slow turn of my own head beneath the fountain's surface. Morning came too quickly, the faint gray light of dawn slipping through my curtains as I sat on the edge of my bed, clutching the small silver coin between my fingers. The metal was cool against my skin, worn smooth from the countless hands that must have held it before mine. Beside me, a folded slip of paper rested against the edge of my pillow, the poem I'd written in the early hours when sleep had refused to come. It was simple, no great work of art, just a few lines scrawled in shaky handwriting as I tried to put into words the faint, uneasy gratitude I felt toward the garden that had both sheltered and threatened me. I walk your paths with careful steps, through sun and shadow's veil. Your blooms, both kind and cruel, remind that silence holds a tale. Beneath these leaves, I leave my words, a promise here to sow, to care, to tend, to honor well, and learn what I must know. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it into my jacket pocket beside the coin. This time, I won't forget. The air clung to my skin the moment I unlocked the garden gate, warmer than it should have been for the early morning hour. The faint hum of insects drifted from the flower beds, mingling with the distant buzz of city traffic beyond the walls. I stepped inside, letting the gate swing shut behind me with a soft click as I made my way toward the oak tree at the far end of the garden. My footsteps echoed faintly against the stone pathway, the worn leather pouch at my belt shifting with each step as though urging me forward. The oak's branches stretched wide against the pale sky, their leaves shifting faintly despite the still air. Beneath the tree's gnarled roots, the soil lay bare. Waiting, I knelt beside the trunk, brushing aside a stray vine as I dug a small hollow in the earth with my fingers. The soil was cool and damp against my skin, its faint scent earthy and rich with the life it nurtured. Carefully, I placed the folded poem inside the hollow, pressing the silver coin atop the paper before covering them both with a thin layer of soil. The moment my fingers brushed the earth, the air shifted, warmth spreading through the ground like a pulse beneath my skin. A faint hum, too low to be sound, vibrated through the roots beneath my hands. Leaves rustled overhead, though no breeze stirred the air, and the faint scent of blooming flowers grew stronger, sweet and sharp, like the breath of something waking after a long sleep. I stood slowly, brushing the soil from my hands as the faint pressure of unseen eyes seemed to lift slightly from my shoulders. Around me, the garden stirred, roses unfurling their petals with deliberate grace, tulips standing taller in the morning light. Even the white lilies seemed to tilt toward the sun, their faint edges curling back as though tasting the air. The weight in my chest eased slightly, and for the first time in days, I breathed without feeling watched. By mid-morning, the garden hummed with quiet life. Tourists wandered the paths, their footsteps soft against the stone as they paused to admire the flowers blooming more vibrantly than before. Tulips opened in perfect symmetry beneath the sun, their petals rich with color, while roses draped the archways in cascades of crimson and ivory. Near the fountain, a young woman paused to take a photo, her voice drifting faintly as she spoke to her friend. "Have you ever seen flowers this bright? It's like they're glowing." Her friend crouched beside a cluster of white hydrangeas, fingertips brushing the petals with reverent care. "It feels different here. Alive, somehow." I adjusted the canvas tool belt on my hip, heart beating a little faster at the words. The garden had noticed. As I trimmed a vine near the southern archway, the faint brush of wings stirred the air beside my cheek. I paused, glancing over my shoulder just as a flicker of blue caught the corner of my vision. A butterfly, its wings a vibrant shade of azure that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight. It hovered beside me for a heartbeat, then drifted closer, landing lightly on the edge of my shoulder. Its wings fanned open once, then closed, as though testing the air. I held still, breath caught somewhere between wonder and hesitation. The butterfly lingered for a moment longer, then took flight, disappearing among the leaves before I could move. The old lady sat by the fountain as always, her hands resting gently in her lap as she watched the rippling water with distant eyes. I paused beside her, heart still light from the butterfly's touch as I offered a polite nod. "Good morning." This time she turned toward me with a faint smile, not as warm as before, but no longer distant. Her gaze lingered as though measuring something I couldn't see. "It listens when you speak," she said softly, her voice carrying the faint rasp of age. "Kindness is remembered as much as betrayal. Don't forget that, child." I swallowed, unsure how to respond. Before I could speak, she turned back to the fountain, her gaze drifting to the rippling surface with the faintest furrow of her brow. The air seemed to press heavier against my skin as I stepped back, the warmth of the sun no longer quite reaching my shoulders as I turned toward the pathway beyond. As the sun dipped lower, shadows stretched long and thin across the stone. The coffee shop umbrellas cast deep pools of shade beside the wrought iron tables, their edges too sharp against the fading light. I paused near the statue of the woman holding a rose, my footsteps slowing despite the warning that echoed faintly in my mind. Her stone eyes gazed downward as always, her expression carved with delicate sorrow, but the rose in her hands seemed different. Its petals, once pale and weathered, now glistened faintly as though touched by dew, the edges sharper beneath the fading sun. I quickened my pace without looking back, the faint pressure of unseen eyes returning just enough to quicken the beat of my pulse. By the time I locked the garden gate that evening, the air had cooled with the faint promise of approaching dusk. The distant hum of traffic echoed softly from the city streets beyond, but the warmth beneath my skin lingered, a faint echo of the garden's pulse against my chest. As I turned toward the stairs, a faint whisper stirred the air behind me, soft and distant, like the brush of leaves against stone. I didn't look back. I should have left earlier. The thought circled through my mind like a warning drumbeat as I cleared the last of the art exhibition's clutter from the garden paths. Easels stood empty beneath the coffee shop umbrellas, their frames still faintly warmed from the lights that had illuminated them for hours. Crumpled flyers and stray pamphlets lay scattered along the walkways, caught between the stones like fallen leaves. Most of the guests had left by 11, their laughter fading into the night as the last footsteps echoed down the rooftop stairs. But the artists lingered, packing up canvases, adjusting lighting, and chatting in low voices that seemed too loud against the hush of the sleeping garden. I glanced at my phone. 11:42 p.m. The air felt heavier than usual as I swept the last scraps of paper into a canvas bag slung over my shoulder. Shadows pooled thick beneath the trees, their edges blurred and uncertain beneath the faint glow of distant city lights. The air smelled of earth and distant rain, though the sky overhead was clear. Never remain in the garden past midnight. My gaze flicked toward the oak tree at the far edge of the garden. Its branches shifted faintly, as though stirred by a breeze that never touched the air around me. The faint gleam of my last offering lay buried beneath its roots, but tonight the soil beneath the tree seemed darker, too still beneath the weight of unseen eyes. I swallowed the knot in my throat and bent to gather the last of my tools. The sound began just before midnight. A faint rustle, so soft that I might have imagined it, stirred somewhere behind the roses. I froze, hand tightening around the pruning shears as the air seemed to press closer against my skin. The faint hum of distant traffic had faded, leaving only the heavy silence of the garden as it watched. Another rustle. Closer this time. Leaves. Just leaves shifting against the stone. I forced a breath and moved faster, my footsteps echoing too loudly as I crossed the stone path toward the maintenance shed. My pulse tapped against my throat, the echo of the garden's rules heavy in my mind. Never remain in the garden past midnight. If you hear leaves rustling when there's no wind, do not look back. Leave immediately. But I wasn't finished. My fingers fumbled with the latch of the shed as I tucked the pruning shears and trowel into their places beside the canvas bag of discarded leaves. The air thickened around me, clinging to my skin with a weight that pressed against my chest. Just a few more minutes. The clock struck midnight. The air shifted, as though the garden itself had inhaled. I straightened from the shed, heart hammering as the air grew dense, thick and humid, like the pressure before a storm. The faint scent of earth deepened into something richer, older, threaded with the distant sweetness of overripe flowers. The leaves stirred without wind. Vines curled slowly along the edges of the stone paths, their tips twitching faintly as though tasting the air. The roses nearest to me shifted, their petals brushing against one another with faint whispers that echoed too far beneath the ground. I stepped back, boots scraping against stone as the breath caught in my chest. The air pressed against my skin, warm and thick with something that watched from beyond the leaves. Don't look. Don't look back. The first footsteps sounded behind me, soft, steady, just beyond the curve of the path. I froze. If you hear leaves rustling when there's no wind, do not look back. Leave immediately. I took a slow breath. My pulse pounded against my ribs, the pressure of unseen eyes heavy against my shoulders as though waiting for me to turn. The footsteps came again, closer now, slow and deliberate against the stone. I moved. My boots struck hard against the path as I crossed the garden, breath coming too fast as the air clung thick around me. The vines shifted at the edges of my vision, trailing beside me as though reaching unseen fingers toward my ankles. Don't run. Don't look back. The whispers grew louder. Low voices tangled beneath the brush of leaves against stone, soft words spoken in a language older than the walls themselves. Their syllables slid through the air like breath against glass, too distant to understand but close enough to chill my bones. The footsteps followed faster, echoing through the still air with a rhythm that matched my own. I walked faster. The white lilies blurred past my vision, their petals folded tight as though bracing against unseen eyes. Roots cracked faintly beneath the soil, shifting just beneath the surface as though preparing to break through. The footsteps quickened. Don't run. Don't run. Don't. The sound of leaves tearing against stone broke the air just behind me. I ran. The air burned against my lungs as I sprinted toward the exit, the sound of footsteps and rustling leaves crashing after me with every step. The pathways blurred past in streaks of gray and green as vines lashed faintly against my boots, dragging against the edges of my jeans with soft, dry whispers. The coffee shop umbrellas loomed ahead, their shadows stretched too long against the stone as though reaching for my heels. The faint gleam of the glass exit door burned against my vision, sharp with the promise of air that didn't press against my skin with invisible hands. Footsteps pounded behind me. Faster. Closer. I hit the door with both hands and shoved it open. Air colder than ice slapped against my face as I stumbled outside, my boots striking hard against the rooftop stairs. The sound of rustling leaves crashed forward, as though something rushed toward the exit, too fast, too close. The glass door slammed shut behind me with a hollow thud that echoed against the stone walls. Silence fell. I stood trembling against the railing, breath tearing through my lungs as sweat chilled against my skin. The city lights beyond the rooftop swam with faint halos of gold and silver as my vision blurred with the rush of adrenaline still pounding in my veins. Beneath the distant hum of traffic, the faint rustle of leaves stirred one final time, soft and distant beyond the glass. And then it was gone. I didn't return until late the next morning. The air beyond the garden gate felt colder than before as I stepped inside, boots striking softly against the stone path. Sunlight filtered pale and thin through the leaves, its warmth failing to reach the shadows beneath the trees. The white lilies stood wilted beneath the pale light. Their petals drooped against the soil, edges tinged with faint streaks of brown despite the morning sun overhead. Even the grass beneath their stems had begun to pale as though pulling away from the soil itself. I knelt beside them, fingertips brushing the soil with careful pressure. The earth was colder than before. My gaze drifted toward the oak tree beyond the fountain. Its branches stretched wide as always, their leaves shifting faintly in the morning breeze. But as I approached, my heart clenched tight against my ribs. A single crack, thin as a strand of hair, ran through the bark just above the soil. The faint warmth of the earth beneath its roots had faded, replaced by a silence that pressed against my skin with faint, invisible weight. Kindness is remembered as much as betrayal. The old lady sat beside the fountain with her hands folded in her lap. This time, she did not smile as I passed. The air shifted. It wasn't just the lilies. By midday, the entire garden had begun to change. Vines crept across the stone pathways, their green tendrils curling like searching fingers. They twitched faintly when I passed, as though tasting the air. Flowers no longer swayed gently in the breeze. They leaned toward me as if listening, petals trembling with faint whispers too soft to understand. Near the fountain, a group of tourists paused with uneasy expressions, their laughter fading into uncertain silence. "Did you feel that?" one woman asked, rubbing her arms as though brushing away a chill. "Yeah." It got colder all of a sudden. Her companion glanced toward the fountain, then stepped back with a nervous laugh. "Weird. Come on, let's go." I stood frozen beside the hydrangeas, clippers cold in my hand as the tourists hurried past. Their footsteps faded beneath the faint hum of unseen whispers, carried on air that had grown thick and heavy despite the sun overhead. By afternoon, the old lady still hadn't appeared. I paused beside the fountain, brushing dirt from my gloves as the faint rustle of leaves echoed too far beneath the ground. The air tasted faintly metallic, tinged with the distant scent of earth disturbed too deeply. "Good afternoon," I murmured, half expecting her distant gaze to turn toward me as it always had. Silence. The stone bench stood empty beside the fountain, its weathered surface stained faintly darker where her presence had worn the stone smooth. The faint ripple of water echoed against the hollow air as the fountain's reflection shifted faintly beneath the sun, too still, too expectant. I stepped back quickly, pulse tapping against my throat as unseen eyes seemed to weigh the air around me. The tourists left before sunset. Their footsteps faded down the rooftop stairs as the distant hum of traffic grew louder beneath the falling dusk. Shadows stretched longer than they should beneath the coffee shop umbrellas, their edges too sharp against the fading light. I hurried to finish my work before the air grew heavier with night. The pruning shears clinked faintly against my belt as I gathered stray leaves from beneath the maples, boots scraping softly against the stone with each hurried step. The roses leaned closer as I passed, petals brushing faintly against my sleeve with whispers I couldn't quite hear. Kindness is remembered as much as betrayal. I paused beside the white lilies near the garden center, brushing my fingertips against the nearest bloom. Its petals felt thin and papery beneath my touch, withered despite the water I'd given them that morning. The edges had begun to brown, curling inward as though retreating from the air itself. I knelt beside the flower bed, pulse slowing slightly as I brushed loose soil from beneath the roots. A faint ripple of warmth stirred against my fingertips, the earth shifting faintly beneath the pressure of my hand. But the warmth faded almost instantly, replaced by a hollow stillness that clung too tightly to my skin. I stood quickly, heart tapping faster, as the faint rustle of leaves echoed somewhere beyond the fountain. Go home. Don't stay past sunset. The reflection was waiting. I hadn't intended to look at the fountain, not after what I'd seen days before, but something in the air seemed to pull my gaze toward the rippling water as I passed. Its grin was wider this time. My reflection's eyes met mine from beneath the water, lips curving into a smile that stretched too far. Too many teeth, pale against the dark ripple of water beneath the stone. The sun had not yet set. I stumbled back, breath catching in my throat as the air shifted with sudden weight. The faint hum of distant whispers echoed through the air, too soft to understand, too close to ignore. Leaves stirred without wind. The garden shifted. Stone cracked beneath my feet as roots split through the pathway, tearing jagged lines across the worn surface. The distant hum of the city faded beneath the creak of shifting branches as vines twisted free from the walls, snapping loose with sharp cracks that echoed through the air. Leaves rustled without wind, brushing against my sleeves with deliberate weight as ivy crept along the garden walls like searching fingers. The air thickened, pressing against my skin as though the garden itself had inhaled and refused to exhale. The first vine brushed my ankle. I jerked back with a sharp breath, boots scraping against stone as I stumbled toward the exit. But the roots beneath the path shifted with sudden force, splitting the stone beneath my steps as the air pressed harder against my chest. If you hear leaves rustling when there's no wind, do not look back. Leave immediately. I ran. Vines lashed against my legs as I sprinted toward the gate, their tips curling against my ankles as though testing their grip. The air burned against my skin with invisible heat, each breath shallow against the weight pressing tighter against my lungs. The whispers grew louder, too close, too many. Go. Go now. The first vine caught my boot. I hit the ground hard, breath tearing from my chest as stones scraped against my palms. The air thickened as though the garden itself had swallowed sound. The distant hum of the city vanished beneath the rush of blood in my ears. Leaves rustled in the air just above my head. Too close, too fast. I shoved my hands against the ground and scrambled forward, boots slipping against the cracked stone as the vines tangled against my ankles. Their tips coiled against my skin with deliberate pressure, pulling tight as though testing my weight. The white lilies stood just ahead. The garden is punishing you. The lilies, save the lilies. I grabbed the watering can from where it had fallen beside the path, the metal warm beneath my hand despite the chill in the air. The water inside sloshed faintly against the sides as I lunged toward the flower bed, vines snapping against my legs with sharp, stinging force. Roots cracked through the soil beneath the lilies, coiling around their stems as though choking them from the earth itself. The air burned against my lungs as I dropped to my knees beside the flower bed, heart hammering against my ribs as the first vine wrapped around my wrist, tight and cold against my skin. Don't stop. Don't stop. I tilted the watering can and poured. The water struck the soil with a sharp hiss, soaking into the earth beneath the lily's roots as the air seemed to pulse with sudden heat. The nearest flower tilted toward the sound of water, its petals curling faintly against the air as though tasting the faint moisture that clung to the soil. The vine around my wrist tightened. I gasped, wrenching my arm free with a sharp twist that burned against my skin as the leaves lashed against my shoulders. Thorns scraped against my sleeves as though testing the pressure before biting deeper against the fabric. The whispers sharpened, no longer distant. I'm sorry, please, I'm sorry. The words tumbled from my lips in a breathless whisper as I poured the last of the water onto the soil. The lilies shifted faintly, their petals trembling against the air as the roots beneath them loosened with faint, creaking resistance. I'll take care of you, I'll follow the rules. The vines lashed against my legs, twisting tighter as the soil beneath my knees cracked with sudden heat. The air clung to my skin as though trying to pull me deeper, roots curling against my ankles, dragging slowly against the edge of my boots. I swear, I'll do better. The last drop of water struck the soil. Silence. The air exhaled. The pressure vanished, as though a hand had lifted from my chest. The air hung heavy with silence. The garden paused as though holding its breath. Vines loosened faintly around my legs, their grip hesitant but unyielding, as if weighing my presence against the soil itself. The white lilies swayed faintly in the air between us, their petals trembling as though waiting for an unseen verdict. Somewhere beyond the fountain, leaves whispered faintly against stone, soft voices brushing against the edges of my thoughts without words. It's listening. My pulse pounded against my ribs as the air pressed thick against my skin. The vines coiled in slow pulses around my calves, neither tightening nor releasing, as though waiting for something unseen. A faint ripple of movement stirred the air beside the fountain. The old lady had returned. Her figure shifted faintly against the stone, her dark shawl trailing softly against the ground as she stood beside the fountain's edge. Though her hands rested lightly against her lap, her gaze burned sharper than before, no longer distant but knowing. Her eyes met mine with deliberate weight. "Speak from your heart," she said. Her voice echoed faintly beneath the air's pressure, soft but certain. "The garden listens." I swallowed against the tightness in my chest. "I'm sorry," I whispered, the words rough against my throat. "I know I broke the rules. I know I made mistakes, but I never wanted to hurt this place. I've never seen anything like it. The flowers, the trees, the way the air feels alive. I love this garden." The air stirred faintly as though shifting beneath the weight of my words. Roots pressed faintly against my ankles, curling slow and deliberate as if testing the air. I swallowed hard. I know the rules matter. I understand that now. I should have respected them, and I will. I'll make sure no one else damages this place. I'll protect it. I swear I will. My breath hitched faintly as the pressure against my chest eased by a fraction. The faint hum of distant whispers softened into a low murmur beneath the leaves, too far to hear, but close enough to feel. I don't want to hurt this garden. I want to help it grow. I love its beauty. I love its life. The air stilled. The whispers stopped. The roots released me. I stumbled back as the vines loosened from my legs, falling limp against the stone with faint, rustling sighs. The air softened against my skin, no longer pressing with invisible weight, as the leaves overhead shifted faintly in the breeze. The lilies stood taller. Their petals began to unfurl one by one, each bloom opening wider beneath the air's faint warmth. Their stems straightened against the soil as the faint hum beneath the earth deepened into something slower, more certain, as though the pulse of the garden had steadied. A faint shimmer of warmth stirred beneath my fingertips as I touched the nearest blossom. Its petals tilted faintly toward my hand, soft as silk beneath my touch. Somewhere beyond the fountain, branches shifted faintly against the air. I turned toward the oak tree, breath catching in my chest as the faint crack in its bark sealed itself with a low, hollow sound, soft as roots shifting deep beneath the earth. The whispers had stopped. Silence settled heavy across the garden, not with the weight of judgment, but with the hush of something ancient withdrawing its gaze. The old lady smiled. Her eyes softened faintly as though some unseen burden had lifted from her shoulders. Her gaze lingered on the white lilies for a moment longer before she met my eyes. "Well done," she murmured. Her voice seemed to drift from somewhere beyond the air, distant and soft as though woven into the leaves themselves. "You've made your promise. The garden remembers." Her smile lingered faintly, as though she might say more, but the air shifted before she could speak. A faint breeze stirred the edges of her shawl, trailing thin wisps of mist across the fountain's edge. By the time the breeze faded, she was gone. I sat beside the lilies, breath slowing as the air settled back into its familiar hush. Leaves whispered faintly overhead with the breeze's slow rhythm, no longer tangled with unseen voices. The stone beneath my boots had cooled from the garden's heat, and the distant hum of city traffic drifted faintly through the air, thin and distant, as though reaching from somewhere beyond the rooftop's edge. My pulse slowed to match the garden's quiet rhythm. The fountain's reflection did not smile when I passed. For the first time, I didn't look away. My reflection met my gaze without shifting. No grin, no distant eyes, no wrongness beneath the water's surface. Only my face, framed faintly against the leaves beyond the fountain's edge. Only me. I exhaled softly and turned away. This time, the garden let me go. I never meant to stay. When I first stepped onto the rooftop garden, it was supposed to be temporary, just a job to fill the weeks until they found someone permanent. But weeks turned into months, and before I knew it, the garden had settled into my life like roots sinking deep beneath soil. I wasn't asked to leave. No new gardener arrived to take my place. Somewhere along the way, without a word from Miss Hawthorne or anyone else, the role became mine. I never questioned it. The garden still has its moods. Some mornings, the air hums with warmth the moment I step through the gate, the leaves rustling faintly as though greeting me. The white lilies bloom brighter beneath my care, petals wide and pale as moonlight, their scent drifting faintly through the air even when no breeze stirs the leaves. Visitors pause beside the flower beds with soft smiles and curious glances, their laughter quieter here as though instinctively aware of something unseen. I often hear them murmur about how alive the garden feels, how the air seems warmer when I pass, as though the leaves themselves lean closer to listen. Most days I feel the garden watching. It isn't the heavy, breathless gaze I once feared. Instead, it's something quieter, like the weight of unseen eyes resting just beyond the leaves, watching not with judgment but expectation. I follow the rules. Every morning, the white lilies are watered first, their petals tilting faintly toward the sun as though in approval. Each week, I leave my offering beneath the oak tree, sometimes a silver coin, sometimes a poem scrawled quickly on scrap paper when inspiration strikes between tasks. The oak tree stands tall against the distant skyline, its leaves shifting faintly against the air with a hum I can almost hear. The faint crack in its bark has vanished completely, but I still pause beside it each time I leave an offering, fingertips brushing the rough bark in silent acknowledgement. The old lady still visits. She appears without warning, always seated beside the fountain's edge with her hands resting lightly in her lap. Though her eyes remain distant, her gaze is no longer sharp with unspoken judgment. More often than not, she offers a faint nod as I pass, silent approval woven into the air like the distant hum of unseen roots. I always greet her with a quiet, "Good afternoon." She doesn't always reply, but sometimes, if the air is particularly still, I catch the faint curve of a smile, as though she remembers something I cannot see. The fountain's reflection never smiles, but I still don't look into the water after sunset. Some rules are not worth testing twice. I no longer fear the whispers that drift beneath the leaves. They still echo faintly on certain nights, soft voices weaving through the ivy-covered walls when the air grows thick and still. But the pressure no longer clings to my skin as it once did. The garden has forgiven me, but I know better than to mistake its kindness for mercy. It has a will of its own, and I have no doubt that breaking the rules a third time might not end as kindly. Yet despite everything, I love this place. I love the way the roses brush faintly against my sleeves as I pass, their petals soft as breath against my skin. I love the faint hum beneath the soil when I kneel beside the lilies, fingers trailing against roots that shift faintly against the warmth of my hands. Even on days when the air feels heavier, when the shadows beneath the coffee shop umbrellas stretch too long against the stone, I do not leave. The garden chose me, and as long as I follow the rules, I will stay.